Let's now talk about a feature that is actually common to all objects in JavaScript, and that's getters and setters. So every object in JavaScript can have setter and getter properties. And we call these special properties accessor properties, while the more normal properties are called data properties. So getters and setters are basically functions that get and set a value. So just as the name says, but on the outside, they still look like regular properties. And so let's first take a look at getters and setters in a simple object literal. And for that, I'm going to use the bank account example from the Bankist application. So, very simple object literal here. The owner is Jonas. Then some simple movements. So the values here don't really matter. Okay. Oh, and of course, I'm writing this object all wrong. Maybe you have already been noticing that. Okay, but now it should be correct. All right, but now to add a getter to this object, we can start by basically writing a normal method. So let's say that we want a method to get the latest movement. And so let's call it latest. And then to transform this into a getter, we simply prepend the keyword get. All right. And so let's simply return the last movement here. So that's this dot movements dot slice -1. But this is actually going to return an array. So an array with the last position. And so we can simply take that out using the pop method. And we could have used the structuring as well, but I didn't want to save this into an external variable first. And so now we can use this getter like this. So account, and then we say latest, but we simply use it as a property. All right, so we don't call the method, but instead we write it as if it was just a property. So let's see, and indeed that returns 300. So this can be very useful when we want to read something as a property, but still need to do some calculations before. Okay, and now we can do the same also as a setter. So we say set latest again, and then here we can basically add a new movement to the array. And any setter method needs to have exactly one parameter. So in this case, that's simply a movement. So let's say this dot movements dot push, and then that movement that we just passed into. Now, it is not mandatory to specify a setter when we have a getter for the same property. Okay, so just the getter or just the setter would be enough. And so, how do we use the setter now? So if it was a regular method, then we would have to do this. So account.latest, and then call it with the movement, let's say 50. But now this is actually like a property and not a method. And so we can simply set it just like we set any other property. So we essentially set it equal to 50. And so now if we take a look at the movements here, it will then give us the complete array with the 50 there at the end. And so in a nutshell, this is how getters and setters work for any regular object in JavaScript. Now, however, classes do also have getters and setters, and they do indeed work in the exact same way. And so let's try them out now here in our person class. So here we can, for example, add a getter for the age property. So we can say get age, and then we return the age. So this is of course very similar to the calc age method that we already have here, but that doesn't matter because this is really just a demonstration example. All right. And so like this, we will be able to basically read the age of any object using a property. So let's try that here. For example, Jessica.age. And this time we actually need to log it to the console. And you see here, we now get the same value. All right. So you see that the getter is indeed just like any other regular method that we set on the prototype. And in fact, we can also check that out here. So if we take a look at the prototype of Jessica, it will be right there. Now it has these dots here because it's only calculated once we actually click this. Okay. So here too, it already looks as if it would be a property and not a method. We still have the get method down here, but then it's also kind of added as a property. All right. So that's a very simple use case of a getter, but setters and getters can actually be very useful for data validation. And as an example, let's try some validation with the name. So for that, I will actually change first name here to full name. And so now here we expect a full name. So a name which basically contains a space. So let's say Jessica Davis here. And so now we can create a setter for the full name property, which will check if this is actually a full name. All right. So set full name. And then we need the name itself. And then here we need some logic. So to test if it contains a space, if the name includes a space, and I'm not sure if it is called includes actually. Now let me just test it here very quick. Okay, we have to comment out this part. All right, so this method actually does exist. So I wasn't sure if it only exists on arrays, but indeed it also exists on strings. And so in this case, then we actually want to set this dot full name to the name that was received. But if not, we want to give an alert. So the given name is not a full name. So in this case, what's really important to understand is that we are creating a setter for a property name that does already exist. So full name is already a property that we are trying to set here, but then we also have the setter. And so now what's going to happen is that each time this code here is executed, so whenever we set the full name on the this keyword, then actually this method here, so this setter is going to be executed. And so that name that we pass in as full name will then become this name. All right, let's check that out actually. And so now as we create Jessica here, you will see, and indeed we saw Jessica Davis here, but now we got this crazy error here of maximum call stack size exceeded. Now that's a very cryptic error message, but what happens here is that there is a conflict. So right now, both the setter function and this constructor function are trying to set the exact same property name. And so that gives origin to this weird error. So what we need to do instead is to here create a new property name. And the convention for doing that, so when we have a setter which is trying to set a property that does already exist, then here as a convention we add an underscore. So again, this is just a convention, it's not a JavaScript feature. So it's really just a different variable name to avoid that naming conflict. However, now when we do this, we are actually creating a new variable. so a full name variable. So let's try this now, actually. So if we try to look at Jessica Davis, you see that right now the property that exists is underscore full name. And so right now we cannot do Jessica.fullname because that simply doesn't exist. And so to fix this, we now also need to create a getter for the full name property. And so that will simply return the underscore full name. So let's see. So return this dot full name. And so if we try to do the same now, then you see that we are back to having this full name here. All right. And of course, the actual property that is here is now still underscore full name because, well, that's what we do here in the setter, right? But then we can also compute this full name just as we can compute the age. So this pattern here is important to understand whenever we try to set a property that already exists. Now let's try another name here, just to see what happens. And actually, after all this, so let's create a Walter object here. New person CL, that's right. And now we're just using a name with one word, let's say 1965. And so now we get this error. So Walter is not a full name. And so right now, if we check out Walter, it probably doesn't have any name. And yeah, it doesn't. So just the birth year now. But if we then put it as a full name, so Walter White, then indeed Walter like this, then we get the underscore full name. But just like before, we can then also access Walter.fullname because of that setter, or actually of that getter that we just defined earlier. Okay, great. So this is another nice feature of classes that can be very useful sometimes. Now, we don't need to use getters or setters, and many people actually don't, but yeah, as I just said, sometimes it's nice to be able to use these features, and especially when we need like a validation like this by the time we are creating a new object. So that's essentially what this setter here does. Next up, we're going to take a look at yet another feature of classes, which is static methods. So let's check that out right now.